August 17, 1944. Belgium. A small industrial town called Courcelles was about to witness one of the darkest moments in Belgian history. 20 innocent people would die in a cellar, murdered by their own countrymen. But this story doesn't end with those deaths. What happened next became one of the most significant acts of justice in post-war Europe. Welcome to Wildorian. Today we're diving into the Courcelles Massacre and the reckoning that followed. To understand what happened in Courcelles, we need to go back 4 years earlier. May 1940. German tanks rolled into Belgium. The invasion took just 18 days. Belgium fell. And while most Belgians began 4 years of occupation and resistance, some made a different choice. They collaborated. The Rexist party wasn't new. It had existed since the 1930s, led by a man named Léon de Grelle. Before the war, Rex was a political movement that mixed extreme Catholicism with fascist ideology. They never gained much support. In fact, by 1939, they were nearly irrelevant. But the German occupation changed everything. Suddenly, the Rexists had power, real power. They became the collaborators, the enforcers, the eyes and ears of the Nazi regime in Belgium's French-speaking region of Wallonia. While their leader de Grelle went off to join the Waffen-SS and fight on the Eastern Front, the Rexists who stayed behind in Belgium did something arguably worse. They terrorized their own people. Victor Matthys took over as the acting leader of Rex in 1941. He was younger, only 27 years old, and he was hungry to prove himself. Matthys wasn't just a politician or a propagandist. He was willing to use violence. By 1944, Belgium was caught in a strange moment. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June. Liberation was coming. Everyone knew it. The Germans were retreating. The Belgian resistance was getting bolder. And the Rexists? They were getting desperate. The Rexists knew what was coming. When the Allies arrived, they would be hunted down. They would face trial. They would face execution. So, in those final months of occupation, they became even more brutal. They wanted to maintain control through terror. In the industrial region around Charleroi, the Rexists held significant power. The mayor of the greater Charleroi area was a Rexist named Oswald Engelbin. He wasn't just a bureaucrat, he was a symbol, a Belgian who had chosen to serve the German occupiers. To the resistance, he was a traitor. To the Rexists, he was untouchable. The Belgian resistance didn't see it that way. On August 17, 1944, resistance fighters set an ambush in an area known as the Bois du Rognac, near the towns of Courcelles and Monceau-sur-Sambre. When Engelbin's car came down the road, they opened fire. Engelbin died. So did his wife. So did his teenage son. The resistance had made their statement, but the Rexists were about to make theirs. News of Engelbin's death spread fast. Within hours, the Rexist leadership gathered. Victor Matthys was there. So was Louis Collard, who would later become the last leader of Rex. Joseph Pévenas, the regional Rexist leader, was also present. They made a decision. There would be reprisals. But here's the thing. They didn't go after resistance fighters. They couldn't. The resistance operated in shadows, moving constantly, protected by the population. So the Rexists did what cowards do. They went after innocent people instead. That evening, Rexist militia spread out across Courcelles. They had a list, not a list of terrorists or resistance members, a list of respected citizens, community leaders, people who had done nothing except perhaps be too vocal in their disapproval of the occupation. One by one, they were dragged from their homes. There was Father Pierre Harmignie, the Dean of Charleroi since 1938. He was 66 years old and had spent years speaking out against the Nazis from his pulpit. The Germans and their collaborators hated him for it. There were lawyers, men who had spent their lives upholding the law. There were engineers, doctors, and police officers. These weren't criminals. They were the pillars of society, people who kept their community running. There was even a woman named Jane Barth, a teacher at the local high school. She was 44 years old. By nightfall, more than 20 people had been rounded up. They were taken to a requisitioned house on what is now called Rue des Martyrs, the Street of Martyrs. The location was deliberate. It was near the spot where Engelbein had been killed. The prisoners were locked in the cellar. Think about that moment. These people knew what was coming. This wasn't an arrest. This wasn't a trial. They had been kidnapped by armed men wearing Belgian uniforms, speaking Belgian French, serving a foreign occupier. In that cellar, as night fell, Father Harmignie did what priests do. He comforted the others. He prayed with them. Witnesses would later say he remained calm, trying to give strength to those around him. Some of those prisoners were young men. Some were elderly. All of them were terrified. Meanwhile, outside, their captors prepared. The Rexists knew what they were about to do. They knew it was murder, not justice. They knew the sounds of what was coming would carry through the neighborhood, so they came up with a plan. They started the engines of their vehicles and revved them loud. The noise would cover the gunfire. At dawn on August 18th, they brought the prisoners out in groups. They shot them. 19 people died that morning. 2 others somehow survived the massacre, though sources vary on the exact details of how. Most of the bodies were left where they fell, dumped in a heap as a warning to anyone else who might resist. The Rexists wanted people to see what happened when you opposed them. They wanted terror. But here's what they didn't count on. The terror didn't work anymore. Liberation was days away, and everyone knew it. The Rexists had just signed their own death warrants. The Rexists didn't hide what they'd done. In fact, they publicized it, but they lied about it. Newspapers across occupied Belgium carried the story. German propaganda officials made sure of it. The headlines claimed that Oswald Engelbein and his family had been brutally murdered by terrorists. And in response, the story went, 20 resistance fighters had been executed. It was all false. The victims in Courcelles weren't resistance fighters. They were hostages, innocent civilians. The Rexists and Germans knew it. But the propaganda served a purpose. It was meant to justify the unjustifiable. It was meant to make murder look like legitimate reprisal. This is how occupation works. Violence is reframed as justice. Victims are reframed as criminals, and the occupier writes the narrative. But in August 1944, that narrative was falling apart. On September 2, 1944, British troops entered Brussels. The next day, they liberated the rest of Belgium. The German occupation was over, and suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. When the Allies liberated Belgium, chaos erupted. The resistance, the public, and returning soldiers all wanted revenge. Collaborators were dragged into the streets. Some were beaten. Some were shot on the spot. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public. It was rough justice, mob justice. But it was also human. These people had endured 4 years of brutal occupation. They had watched their neighbors disappear into concentration camps. They had lived under curfews, food rationing, and constant fear. Now, they wanted payback. The new Belgian government knew they had to restore order. Belgium couldn't become a nation of lynch mobs. They needed trials. They needed legal justice. So Belgium set up a system of military tribunals to prosecute collaborators. The charges were serious: treason, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Between 1944 and 1950, Belgium conducted thousands of trials. Thousands of people were convicted of collaboration. But the death penalty? That was reserved for the worst of the worst. In total, 242 people were executed in Belgium after World War II for collaboration. That's out of thousands convicted. Most collaborators received prison sentences. The executions were for those who had committed murder, torture, or direct acts of violence against civilians. And the Courcelles Massacre was the kind of crime that guaranteed execution. Victor Mathis was captured. So was José Striel, another high-ranking Rexist. Louis Collard was also caught, though his role in the massacre would be debated. Joseph Pevenas, the regional leader who helped organize the killings, faced trial. But not everyone was caught. Léon de Grelle, the founder and leader of Rex, escaped. As the war ended, he fled to Norway, then to Spain. The Spanish dictator Francisco Franco gave him protection. Belgium tried to extradite him. They convicted him in absentia and sentenced him to death, but Franco refused. De Grelle would live out the rest of his life in Spain, a free man, dying in 1994 at the age of 87. But the others? They weren't so lucky. Victor Matthys stood trial in 1947. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about the roundups, the cellar, the executions. The prosecution had documentation. They had survivors. They had no difficulty proving what had happened. Matthys was found guilty of treason and war crimes. Specifically, he was convicted of ordering the execution of 20 civilians in Courcelles. The sentence was death. On November 10, 1947, Victor Matthys was executed by firing squad. He was 33 years old. José Streel, the intellectual of the Rexist movement and a key propagandist, was also executed. Others received prison sentences. Jean Denis, a more minor Rexist figure, was imprisoned but not executed. The exact number of Rexists executed specifically for the Courcelles Massacre is difficult to pin down from historical records. What we know is that multiple perpetrators were convicted, and the massacre was cited in several trials. The number 27 may refer to the total number of victims across multiple Rexist atrocities in the region during those August days, as some sources indicate 27 people died in total during the 17th and 18th of August in various killings by Rexists. What's clear is this: Belgium took the Courcelles Massacre seriously. The perpetrators were hunted down, tried, and executed. It was justice, legal justice, in a time when it would have been easy to simply shoot collaborators in the street. Today, if you go to Courcelles, there's a memorial. It stands on Rue des Martyrs, the Street of Martyrs, at the exact spot where most of the bodies were found. The names of the victims are engraved there: Father Pierre Harmignie, Jane Barth, lawyers, engineers, police officers, people who did nothing wrong except live in an occupied country. Every year people gather there to remember. But here's what I think is important about this story. It's not just about a massacre, it's about what came after. See, World War II was full of atrocities. We know about the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the millions murdered by the Nazi regime. We know about the war crimes committed by German soldiers across Europe. But the story of collaboration, of people who betrayed their own countrymen, that's more complicated. Collaborators weren't all the same. Some were opportunists who wanted power. Some were ideologues who believed in fascism. Some were just scared people trying to survive. After the war, Europe had to figure out what to do with all of them. Some countries chose forgiveness and amnesia. They moved on quickly, trying to rebuild without digging too deep into who did what during the war. Belgium chose differently. Belgium chose accountability. 242 executions in a country of 8 million people. That's not a lot, but it's significant. Belgium drew a line. They said, if you murdered civilians, if you tortured people, if you actively participated in atrocities, you will pay with your life. But if you were just a low-level collaborator, a bureaucrat who kept the trains running, or a policeman who followed orders without killing anyone, you'd face prison, but not death. That's a system of justice, not revenge. And I think that matters, because after a war like World War II, it's easy for societies to fall apart. It's easy for justice to become vengeance, for trials to become theater, for executions to become spectacle. Belgium avoided that. They set up military tribunals with real judges, real lawyers, real evidence. The trials weren't perfect, but they were trials. The men who organized the Courcelles Massacre faced justice. They weren't lynched by a mob. They were convicted in a court of law with evidence and witnesses, and then they were executed according to the law. That's important. The Courcelles Massacre is one of those stories that asks difficult questions. What do you do when your neighbors become your enemies? What do you do when people who speak your language, who grew up in your town, who share your culture, turn against you, and side with an invader? Belgium faced those questions in 1944, and their answer was clear. They said, "You will face justice, not mob justice, legal justice." 20 innocent people died in Courcelles on August 18, 1944. They died because they lived in occupied territory and because cowards with guns chose to murder them rather than face the resistance fighters who actually posed a threat. But those cowards didn't get away with it. Victor Mathis, the man who ordered the massacre, faced a firing squad. José Streel, the propagandist who justified it, faced a firing squad. Others went to prison, and their organization, the Rexist Party, was banned and destroyed. That's not revenge, that's justice. And in a world torn apart by war, that distinction matters. The memorial in Courcelles stands today as a reminder, not just of the people who died, but of the principle that Belgium fought to uphold, that even after the worst atrocities, even after occupation and collaboration and murder, justice is still possible. Thanks for watching Wildorian. If you found this story as powerful as I did, hit that subscribe button. History isn't just about battles and dates, it's about choices. And the people of Belgium, both the victims and the survivors, made theirs. See you in the next one.